हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो अब हम देखने वाले हैं एनसीईआरटी इकोनॉमिक्स का क्लास 11 का, जिसमें आज हम देखेंगे चैप्टर 7 जो कि है एम्प्लॉयमेंट ग्रोथ इन्फॉर्मलाइजेशन एंड अदर इशूज़। तो शुरू करते हैं हमारा आज का चैप्टर। व्हाट आई ऑब्जेक्ट टू इज द क्रेज फॉर मशीनरी, नॉट मशीनरी एज सच। द क्रेज इज फॉर व्हाट दे कॉल लेबर सेविंग मशीनरी. Men go on saving labor till thousands are without work and thrown on the open streets to die of starvation. Mahatma Gandhi. Introduction. People do a variety of works. Some work on farms, in factories, banks, shops, and many other workplaces. Yet a few other work at home. Work at home includes not only traditional work like weaving, lace making, or variety of handicrafts, but also modern jobs like programming work in the IT industry. Earlier, factory work meant working in factories located in cities, whereas now technology has enabled people to produce those factory-based goods at home in villages. Why do people work? Work plays an important role in our lives as individuals and as members of society. People work for earning a living. Some people get or have money by inheriting it, not working for it. This does not completely satisfy anybody. Being employed in work gives us a sense of self worth and enables us to relate ourselves meaningfully with others. Every working person is actively contributing to national income and hence the development of the country by engaging in various economic activities. That is the real meaning of earning a living. We do not work only for ourselves. We also have a sense of accomplishment when we work to meet the requirements of those who are dependent on us. Having recognized the importance of work, Mahatma Gandhi insisted upon education and training through a variety of works including craft. Studying about working people gives us insights into the quality and nature of employment in our country and helps in understanding and planning our human resources. It helps us to analyze the contribution made by different industries and sectors towards national income. It also helps us to address many social issues such as exploitation of marginalized sections of the society, child labor, etc. Workers and employment. What is employment? Who is a worker? When a farmer works on fields, he or she produces food grains and raw materials for industries. Cotton becomes cloth in textile mills, and in power looms, lorries transport goods from one place to another. We know that the total money value of all such goods and services produced in a country in a year is called its gross domestic product for that year. When he when we can also consider what we pay for our imports and get from our exports, we find that there is a net earning for the country which may be positive if we have exported more in value terms than imported, or negative if imports exceed exports in value terms, or zero if exports and imports were of the same value. When we add this earning plus or minus from foreign transactions, is what we get is called the country's gross national product for that year. Those activities which contribute to the gross national product are called economic activities. All those who are engaged in economic activities in whatever capacity, high or low, are workers. Even if some of them temporarily abstain from work due to illness, injury, or other physical disability, bad weather, festivals, social or religious functions, they are also workers. Workers also include all those who help the main workers in these activities. We generally think of only those who are paid by an employer for their work as workers. This is not so. Those who are self employed are also workers. The nature of employment in India is multifaceted. Some get employment throughout the year, some others get employed for only a few months in a year. Many workers do not get fair wages for their work. While estimating the number of workers, all those who are engaged in economic activities are included as employed. You might be interested in knowing the number of people actively engaged in various economic activities. During 2011 to 12, India had about 473 million strong workforce. Since majority of our people reside in rural areas, the proportion of workforce residing there is higher. The rural workers constitute about three-fourths of these 473 million. Men form the majority of workforce in India. About 70% of the workers are men and the rest are women. Men and women include child laborers in respective sexes. Women workers account for one-third of the rural workforce, whereas in urban areas they are just one-fifth of the workforce. Women carry out works like cooking, fetching water and fuelwood and participate in farm labor. They are not paid wages in cash or in the form of grains. At times they are not paid at all. For this reason, these women are not categorized as workers. Economists have argued that these women should also be called workers. Participation of people in employment. Worker population ratio is an indicator which is used for analyzing the employment situation in the country. This ratio is useful in knowing the proportion of population that is actively contributing to the production of goods and services of a country. If the ratio is higher, it means that the engagement of people is greater. If the ratio for a country is medium or low, it means that a very high proportion of its population is not involved directly in economic activities. You might have already studied in lower classes the meaning of the term population. Population is defined as the total number of people who reside in a particular locality at a particular point of time. If you want to know the worker population ratio for India, divide the total number of workers in India by the population in India and multiply it by 100. You will get the worker population ratio for India. If you look at table 7.1, it shows the different levels of participation of people in economic activities. For every 100 persons, about 39 by rounding of 38.6 are workers in India. In urban areas, the proportion is about 36, whereas in rural India, the ratio is about 40. Why is there such a difference? People in rural areas have limited resources to earn a higher income and participate more in the employment market. Many do not go to schools, colleges, and other training institutions. Even if some go, they discontinue in the middle to join the workforce. Whereas in urban areas, a considerable section is able to study in various educational institutions. Urban people have a variety of employment opportunities. They look for the appropriate job to suit their qualifications and skills. In rural areas, people cannot stay at home as their economic condition may not allow them to do so. Compared to females, more males are found to be working. The difference in participation rates is very large in urban areas. For every 100 urban women, only 15 are engaged in some economic activities. In rural areas, for every 100 rural women, about 25 participate in the employment market. Why are women in general and urban women in particular not working? It is common to find that where men to earn high incomes, families discourage female members from taking up jobs. Going back to what has already been mentioned above, many activities for the household engaged in by women are not recognized as productive work. This narrow definition of work leads to non recognition of women's work and therefore to the estimation of the number of women workers in the country. Think of women actively engaged in many activities within the house and at family farms who are not paid for such work, as they certainly contribute to the maintenance of the household and farms. Do you think that their number should be added to the number of women workers? Self-employed and hired workers. Does the worker population ratio say anything about worker status in society or about the working condition? By knowing the status with which a worker is placed in an enterprise, it may be possible to know one dimension, quality of employment in a country. It also enables us to know the attachment a worker has with his or her job and the authority she or he has over the enterprise and over other co-workers. Let us take three workers from the construction industry: a cement shop owner, a construction worker, and a civil engineer of a construction company. Since the status of each one of them is different from another, they are also called differently. Workers who own and operate an enterprise to earn their livelihood are known as self employed. Thus, the cement shop owner is self employed. About 52% workforce in India belongs to this category. The construction workers are known as casual wage laborers. They account for 30% of India's workforce. Such laborers are casually engaged in other farms and in return get a remuneration for the work done. Workers like the civil engineer working in the construction company account for 18% of India's workforce. When a worker is engaged by someone or an enterprise and paid his or her wages on a regular basis, they are known as regular salaried employees. Look at chart 7.1. You will notice that self-employment is a major source of livelihood for both men and women, as this category accounts for more than 50% of the workforce in both diagrams. Casual wage work is the second major source for both men and women, a little more so for the latter, 31%. When it comes to regular salaried employment, men are found to be so engaged in greater proportion. They form 20%, whereas women form only 13%. One of the reasons could be skill requirement. Since regular salaried jobs require skills and a higher level of literacy, women might not have been engaged to a great extent. When we compare the distribution of workforce in rural and urban areas in chart 7.2, you will notice that self-employed and casual wage laborers are found more in rural areas than in urban areas. In the latter, both self-employment and regular wage salaried jobs are greater. In the former, since majority of those depending on farming own plots of land and cultivate independently, the share of self-employed is greater. The nature of work in urban areas is different. Obviously, everyone cannot run factories, shops, and offices of various types. Moreover, enterprises in urban areas require workers on a regular basis. Employment in farms, factories, and offices. In the course of economic development of a country, labor flows from agriculture and other related activities to industry and services. In this process, workers migrate from rural to urban areas. Eventually, at a much later stage, the industrial sector begins to lose its share of total employment as the service sector enters a period of rapid expansion. This shift can be understood by looking at the distribution of workers by industry. Generally, we divide all economic activities into 8 different industrial divisions. They are agriculture, mining and quarrying, manufacturing, electricity, gas and water supply, construction, trade, transport and storage, and services. For simplicity, all working persons engaged in these divisions can be clubbed into three major sectors, viz. Primary sector, which includes sec- secondary sector, which includes 2, 3, 4, and 5, and C. Service sector, which includes divisions 6, 7, and 8. Table 7.2 shows the different industries during the year 2011 to 12. Primary sector is the main source of employment for majority of workers. In India, secondary sector provides employment to only about 24% of workforce. About 27% of workers are in the service sector. Table 7.2 also shows that about 64% of the workforce in rural India depends on agriculture, forestry, and fishing. About 20% of rural workers are working in manufacturing industries, construction, and other industrial activities. Service sector provides employment to only about 16% of rural workers. Agriculture is not a major source of employment in urban areas where people are mainly engaged in the service sector. About 60% of urban workers are in the service sector. The secondary sector gives employment to about 35% of urban workforce. Though both men and women workers are concentrated in the primary sector, women workers' concentration is very high there. About 63% of the female workforce is employed in the primary sector, whereas less than half of males work in that sector. Men get opportunities in both secondary and service sectors. Growth and changing structure of employment. In chapter 2 and 3, you might have studied about the planning strategies in detail. Here we will look at two developmental indicators, growth of employment and GDP. 60 years of planned development have been aimed at expansion of the economy through increase in national output and employment. During the period 1950 to 2010, gross domestic product of India grew positively and was higher than the employment growth. However, there was always fluctuation in the growth of GDP. During this period, employment grew at the rate of not more than 2%. Chart 7.3 also points at another disheartening development in the late 1990s. Employment growth started declining and reached the level of growth that India had in the early stages of planning. During these years, we also find a widening gap between the growth of GDP and employment. This means that in the Indian economy, without generating employment, we have been able to produce more goods and services. Scholars refer to this phenomena as jobless growth. So far, we have seen how employment has grown in comparison to GDP. Now, it is necessary to know how the growth pattern of employment and the GDP affected different sections of workforce. From this, we will also be able to understand what types of employment are generated in our country. Let us look at two indicators that we have seen in the preceding sections: employment of people in various industries and their status. We know that India is an agrarian nation. A major section of population lives in rural areas and is dependent on agriculture as their main livelihood. Developmental strategies in many countries, including India, have aimed at reducing the proportion of people depending on agriculture. Distribution of workforce by industrial sectors shows substantial shift from farm work to non-farm work. In 1970 to 73, about 74% of workforce was engaged in primary sector, and in 2011 to 12, this proportion has declined to about 50%. Secondary and service sectors are showing promising future for the Indian workforce. You may notice that the shares of these sectors have increased from 11 to 24% and 15 to 27% respectively. The distribution of workforce in different sectors indicates that over the last 4 decades, 1972 to 2012, people have moved from self-employment and regular salaried employment to casual wage worker. Yet, self-employment continues to be the major employment provider. Scholars call the process of moving from self-employment and regular salaried employment to casual wage work as casualization of workforce. This makes the workers highly vulnerable. How? Look at the case study of Ahmedabad in the preceding section. In the previous section, we have found that the proportion of casual workers has been increasing. One of the objectives of development planning in India since India's independence has been to provide decent livelihood to its people. It has been envisaged that the industrialization strategy would bring surplus workers from agriculture to industry with better standard of living as in developed countries. We have seen in the preceding section that even after 55 years of planned development, more than half of the Indian workforce depends on farming as the major source of livelihood. Economists argue that over the years the quality of employment has been deteriorating. Even after working for more than 10 to 20 years, why do some workers not get maternity benefit, provident fund, gratuity and pension? Why does a person working in the private sector get a low salary as compared to another person doing the same work but in the public sector? You may find that a small section of Indian workforce is getting regular income. The government, through its labor laws, enable them to protect their rights in various ways. This section of the workforce forms trade unions, bargains with employers for better wages and other social security measures. Who are they? To know this, we classify workforce into two categories: workers in formal and informal sectors, which are also referred to as organized and unorganized sectors. All the public sector establishments and those private sector establishments which employ 10 hired workers or more are called formal sector establishments, and those who work in such establishments are formal sector workers. All other enterprises and workers working in those enterprises form the informal sector. Thus, informal sector includes millions of farmers, agricultural laborers, owners of small enterprises, and people working in those enterprises, as also the self-employed who do not have any hired workers. It also includes all non-farm casual wage laborers who work for more than one employer, such as construction workers and head load workers. Formal sector employment. The information relating to employment in the formal sector is collected by the Union Ministry of Labor through employment exchanges located in different parts of country. Do you know who is the major employer in the formal sector in India? In 2012, out of about 30 million formal sector workers, about 18 million workers were employed by the public sector. Here also men from the majority as women constitute only about one-sixth of the formal sector workforce. Economists point out that the reform process initiated in the early 1990s resulted in a decline in the number of workers employed in the formal sector. What do you think? Those who are working in formal sector enjoy social security benefits. They are more than those in the informal sector. Developmental planning envisages that as the economy grows, more and more workers would become formal sector workers, and the proportion of workers engaged in the informal sector would dwindle. But what has happened in India? Look at the following chart, which gives the distribution of workforce in formal and informal sectors. In section 7.2, we learned that there are about 473 million workers in the country. There are about 30 million workers in the formal sector. Can you estimate the percentage of people employed in the formal sectors in the country? About only 6%, 30 by 473 into 100. Thus, the rest 94% are in the informal sector. Out of 30 million formal sector workers, only 6 million, that is only about 21%, 30 by 6 into 100, are women. In the informal sector, male workers account for 69% of the workforce. Informalization in Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad is a prosperous city with its wealth based on the produce of more than 60 textile mills with a labor force of 150,000 workers employed in them. These workers had, over the course of the century, acquired a certain degree of income security. They had secured jobs with a living wage. They were covered by social security schemes protecting their health and old age. They had a strong trade union which not only represented them in disputes but also ran activities for the welfare of workers and their families. In the early 1980s, textile mills all over the country began to close down. In some places, such as Mumbai, the mills closed rapidly. In Ahmedabad, the process of closure was long drawn out and spread over 10 years. Over this period, approximately 80,000 permanent workers and over 50,000 non permanent workers lost their jobs and were driven to the informal sector. The city experienced an economic recession and public disturbances, especially the city, especially communal riots. A whole class of workers was thrown back from the middle class into the informal sector into poverty. There was widespread alcoholism and suicides. Children were withdrawn from school and sent to work. Since the late 1970s, many developing countries, including India, started paying attention to enterprises and workers in the informal sector as employment in the formal sector is not growing. Workers and enterprises in the informal sector do not get regular income. They do not have any protection or regulation from the government. Workers are dismissed without any compensation. Technology used in the informal sector enterprises is outdated. They also do not maintain any accounts. Workers of this sector live in slums and are squatters. Of late, owing to the efforts of the International Labour Organization, the Indian government has initiated the modernization of informal sector enterprise and provisions of social security measures to informal sector workers. Unemployment. You might have seen people looking for jobs in newspapers. Some look for jobs through friends and relatives. In many cities, you might find people standing in some select areas looking for people to employ them for their day's work. Some go to factories and offices and give their biodata and ask whether there is any vacancy in their factory or office. Many in the rural areas do not go out and ask for a job but stay home when there is no work. Some go to employment exchange and register themselves for vacancies notified through employment exchanges. NSSO defines unemployment as a situation in which all those who owing to lack of work are not working but either seek work through employment exchanges, intermediaries, friends or relatives, or by making application to prospective employers or express their willingness or availability for work under the prevailing condition of work and remunerations. There are a variety of ways by which an unemployed person is identified. Economists define unemployed person as one who is not able to get employment of even 1 hour in half a day. There are three sources of data on unemployment: reports of Census of India, National Sample Survey Organization's reports of employment and unemployment situation, and Directorate General of Employment and Training data of registration with employment exchanges. Though they provide different estimates of unemployment, they do not provide us with the attributes of the unemployed and the variety of unemployment prevailing in our country. Do we have different types of unemployment in our economy? The situation described in the first paragraph of this section is called open unemployment. Economists call unemployment prevailing in Indian farms as disguised employment. What is disguised unemployment? Suppose a farmer has 4 acres of land and he actually needs only 2 workers and himself to carry out various operations on his farm in a year. But if he employs 5 workers and his family members, such as his wife and children, this situation is known as disguised unemployment. One study conducted in the late 1950s showed about 1/3 of agricultural workers in India is disguisedly unemployed. You may have noticed that many people migrate to an urban area, pick up a job, and stay there for some time, but come back to their home villages as soon as the rainy season begins. Why do they do so? This is because work in agriculture is seasonal. There are no employment opportunities in the villages for all months in the year. When there is no work to do on farms, people go to urban areas and look for jobs. This kind of unemployment is known as seasonal unemployment. This is also a common form of unemployment prevailing in India. Though we have witnessed low growth of employment, have you seen people being unemployed over a very long time? Scholars say that in India, people cannot remain completely unemployed for very long because their desperate economic condition would not allow them to be so. You will rather find them being forced to accept jobs that nobody else would do, unpleasant or even dangerous jobs in unclean or unhealthy surroundings. The central and state governments take many initiatives and generate employment to facilitate a decent living for low income families through various measures. This will be discussed in the following section. Government and employment generation. You may recall about the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act 2005. It promises 100 days of guaranteed wage employment to all rural households who volunteer to do unskilled manual labor. This scheme is one of the many measures the government has implemented to generate employment for those who are in need of jobs in rural areas. Since independence, the union and state governments have played an important role in the generating employment or creating opportunities for employment generation. Their efforts can be broadly categorized into two, direct and indirect. In the first category, as you have seen in the preceding section, the government employs people in various departments for administrative purposes. It also runs industries, hotels, and transport companies and hence provides employment directly to workers. When the output of goods and services from government enterprises increases, then private enterprises which receive raw materials from government enterprises will also raise their output and hence increase the number of employment opportunities in the company economy. For example, when a government owned steel company increases its output, it will result in direct increase in employment in their state government company in that government company. Simultaneously, private companies which purchase steel from it will also increase their output and thus employment. This is the indirect generation of employment opportunities by the government initiative in the economy. In chapter 4, you would have noticed that many programs that the governments implement aimed at elevating poverty are through employment generation. They are also known as employment generation programs. All these programs aim at providing not only employment but also services in areas such as primary health, primary education, rural drinking water, nutrition, assistance for people to buy income and employment generating assets, development of community assets by generating wage employment, construction of houses and sanitation, assistance for constructing houses, laying of rural roads, development of wastelands and or degraded lands. Conclusion. There has been a change in the structure of workforce in India. Newly emerging jobs are found mostly in the service sector. The expansion of the service sector and the advent of high technology now frequently permit a highly competitive existence for efficient small scale and often individual enterprises or specialist workers side by side with the multinationals. Outsourcing of work is becoming a common practice. It means that a big firm finds it profitable to close down some of its specialist departments, for example, legal or computer programming or customer service sections, and hand over a large number of small piecemeal jobs to very small enterprises or specialist individuals, sometimes situated even in other countries. The traditional notion of modern factory or office, as a result, has been altering in such a manner that for many the home is becoming the workplace. All of these changes have not gone in favor of the individual worker. The nature of employment has become more informal with only limited availability of social security measures to the workers. In the last 2 decades, there has been rapid growth in the gross domestic product but without simultaneous increase in employment opportunities. This has forced the government to take up initiatives in generating employment opportunities, particularly in the rural areas. Recap. All those persons who are engaged in various economic activities and hence contributes to gross national product are workers. About two-fifths of the total population in country is engaged in various economic activities. Men, particularly rural men, form the major section of workforce in India. Majority of workers in India are self-employed. Casual wage workers, laborers, and regular salaried employees together account for less than half the proportion of India's workforce. About three-fifths of India's workforce depends on agriculture and other allied activities as the major source of livelihood. In recent years, the growth of employment has decelerated. During post-reform period, India has been witness to employment opportunities in the service sector. These new jobs are found mostly in the informal sector and the nature of jobs is also mostly casual. Government is the major formal sector employer in the country. Disguised unemployment is a common form of unemployment in rural India. There has been a change in the structure of the workforce in India. Through various schemes and policies, the government takes initiative to generate employment directly and indirectly. और ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज। तो हमारा ये चैप्टर कंप्लीट होता है। अगर आप चैनल पर नए हैं तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और नोटिफिकेशन आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए ताकि आप डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन कर सकें। साथ ही अगर आपको वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए और अपने दोस्तों के साथ शेयर कर दीजिए ताकि उन्हें भी हेल्प हो सके। तो हमारा आज का सेशन यहीं तक था। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।